We regret to inform you. Charles's voice, smooth and utterly devoid of warmth, drifted across the polished surface of the conference table. The words hung in the air, clinical and expected, yet still carrying the weight of a final pronouncement. He didn't look me in the eye, opting instead to focus on the expensive Mont Blanc pen he tapped rhythmically against a pristine white folder. Beside him, Eleanor offered a sympathetic half-smile that didn't reach her eyes, a performance she'd likely rehearsed. 15 years? 15 years of my life distilled down to a single pre-written sentence, delivered by two people who saw loyalty as an outdated concept, a weakness to be exploited. They spoke of restructuring, of evolving needs, corporate jargon layered thick over the simple, brutal truth. They wanted me gone, and in their minds, they held all the cards. They believed they were delivering a shock, a sudden, devastating blow that would leave me reeling, scrambling, utterly defenseless. They couldn't have been more wrong. As Charles continued his monologue of carefully constructed phrases designed to soften the impact without actually showing any genuine concern, a quiet calm settled over me. It wasn't resignation, it was the stillness that precedes a deliberate, irreversible action, because, unlike them, I wasn't surprised. I had known this moment was coming for weeks. Every sterile word they uttered, every feigned expression of regret, simply confirmed what I had already discovered. They thought they were taking my future. They didn't realize I had already taken theirs. The air in the room felt thick with their assumption of power, their easy dismissal of my history with the company, my dedication, my quiet contributions. They saw me as a relic, a comfortable fixture they could simply switch off. They saw the end of my tenure as a clean, efficient excision. They didn't see the woman sitting across from them, the one who had spent weeks meticulously documenting their casual cruelty, cataloging their ethical lapses, and building a structure of irrefutable facts around their imminent betrayal. They saw an employee being terminated. I saw the first domino falling precisely as I had anticipated. Their lack of foresight, their utter confidence in their ability to operate without consequence, was breathtaking in its arrogance. They were so focused on their immediate goal, removing me, that they were blind to the periphery, deaf to the quiet whispers of their own undoing, and that blindness was going to cost them everything. This sterile room, this carefully orchestrated conversation, wasn't the end they envisioned. It was merely the beginning of the end. They hadn't seen coming. The script had been flipped, and they didn't even know they were reading lines from my version. The silence that followed Charles's final hollow sentence stretched, filled only by the faint hum of the overhead lights and the distant city noise filtering through the double-paned windows. They were waiting for a reaction. Tears, protest, pleading. What they got was a steady gaze, and a composure that must have felt unnerving in its quiet strength. I simply nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement. "I understand," I said, my voice low and even, giving nothing away. The simplicity of the phrase seemed to baffle them slightly. It lacked the expected emotional fallout. It lacked the drama they had implicitly anticipated. It was just a statement of fact, delivered without a hint of despair. They exchanged a brief, uncertain glance, momentarily thrown off their rhythm. They recovered quickly, however, sliding the folder Charles had been tapping across the table towards me. It contained the standard termination paperwork, severance details, non-disclosure agreements, benefits information. The cold, legalistic language was designed to reinforce their position of authority, to box me into a predetermined narrative of departure. They expected me to sign, to accept, to disappear quietly. That folder, in their hands, was a tool of control. In my hands, it would become something else entirely. They waited, postures relaxed, now confident that the difficult part was over. They saw the 15 years of loyalty as a chain they were breaking, not a foundation I had built. They saw me as a problem they were solving, not a force they were unleashing. And their underestimation of me, consistently and reliably, was the single greatest gift they had given me throughout this entire process. It was the blind spot in their carefully constructed world of power and control. It was the crack in their armor, I intended to exploit with surgical precision. The silence stretched again, but this time it felt different. It wasn't awkward. It was charged. It was the quiet before a storm they didn't know was brewing. It was the moment before a carefully aimed strike. And in that silence, as I met their gaze with a look that was calm but held the depth of 15 years of observation and newfound steely resolve, I knew that their surprise was only just beginning. The real shock, the one that would ripple far beyond this room, was yet to come. Before we dive into what happened next, tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? It's always incredible to see how far these stories reach. The story began, not with a sterile conversation in Charles's office, but weeks earlier, on a Tuesday morning that felt like any other. The office hummed with its usual low-level energy, keyboards clicking, phones ringing softly, the murmur of conversations. I was working on a complex quarterly report, the kind that required deep focus and an understanding of the company's intricate financial architecture. My position, senior analyst, wasn't glamorous, but it was vital. I was one of the quiet engines, the people who understood the historical data, the subtle trends, the underlying health, or lack thereof, of the business. My office was small, tucked away near the archives, a place people rarely visited, unless they needed something specific from me. It suited me. I could work without distraction, delve deep into the numbers, and observe the company's internal dynamics from a slight distance. It was this distance, paradoxically, that often gave me a clearer view than those higher up who were too entangled in the politics. The first sign was subtle, easily missed if you weren't paying attention. A closed-door meeting between Charles, Eleanor, and Sarah, the head of HR. Closed-door meetings weren't unusual, but the duration was. And the atmosphere afterward, a strange mix of strained cheerfulness and furtive glances. Sarah, usually pragmatic and direct, seemed flustered, her usual composure slightly off. It was just a flicker, but it registered. Then came the small technical oddities. Access restricted to certain historical databases I routinely used. My standard reporting templates subtly altered without my input. Requests for data that felt redundant, as if someone else were building a parallel system. Individually, they were minor annoyances. Together, they painted a picture of something shifting beneath the surface. The real break came unexpectedly. A misplaced document. It was late one evening. I was tying up loose ends. I needed a specific report from the previous fiscal year. Something buried deep in the physical archives. While searching, I found a file left out of its cabinet, a folder labeled Project Chimera Phase 1. Curious, and frankly feeling a professional obligation to return misplaced confidential documents, I opened it. The contents sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't about a new product or a marketing strategy. It was a detailed plan for a significant workforce reduction within my division. And there, highlighted on a list of target positions, was mine. Not just listed, but with specific notes. Minimal disruption, long tenure, potential severance liability, role redundancy post-consolidation. It was dated weeks prior. The sterile language of corporate strategy masked a cold, calculated dismantling of livelihoods. And mine was on the list. The initial shock wasn't a gasp or a cry. It was a deep internal tremor, a visceral understanding of betrayal. 15 years, loyalty, hard work, all reduced to a line item on a project plan with a mythological codename, Chimera, a monstrous hybrid. Fitting. They were creating something new by destroying something old. My first impulse was denial, then a wave of hurt, so profound it felt physical. It wasn't just about the job, it was about the history, the relationships, the sense of belonging. To know that behind the smiles and the corporate rhetoric, this plan was being quietly executed, was a profound violation of trust, but the hurt quickly solidified into something else. Anger, yes, but not explosive or uncontrolled. It was a quiet, cold fury that settled deep in my core, and with that anger came a sudden sharp clarity. They thought they were operating in secret. They thought they had the element of surprise. They were wrong. I had the knowledge, and knowledge in the right hands is a weapon. My mind, trained by years of analyzing complex data, and identifying hidden patterns, immediately shifted into a strategic mode. This wasn't an emotional crisis to be weathered. It was a problem to be solved, a battle to be fought, quietly, strategically, and on my terms. I didn't put the folder back immediately. I took it to my office, closed the door, and read every single page. The names involved, the timelines, the rationales, thinly veiled excuses. Mostly, I saw Sarah's initials on several pages, confirming her strained demeanor. I saw Charles's and Eleanor's signatures approving key stages. The hierarchy of betrayal was laid bare. I made no copies. I took no photos with my phone. That would be too risky, too easily traced. Instead, I read, and I memorized. I absorbed the details, the key dates, the specific justifications they intended to use. I built a mental map of their plan, understanding its weaknesses, its dependencies, its vulnerabilities. They had laid out their strategy for me. All I had to do was understand how to dismantle it. The hurt was still there, a dull ache beneath the surface, but it was now fuel. It powered the cold, analytical machine my mind had become. They had underestimated me in their plan by assuming my role was redundant. They had underestimated me again by leaving this document where I could find it. Their pattern of underestimation was becoming a dangerous habit for them and a potent advantage for me. I returned the folder precisely where I found it the next morning, making sure there was no trace of my discovery. The office buzzed as usual. Charles and Eleanor were in their corner offices, radiating their usual air of corporate authority. Sarah looked less stressed, perhaps believing the critical stage of Project Chimera had passed. They saw a Tuesday morning. I saw the opening moves. On a chessboard, they didn't know we were playing, and I had just been given sight of their entire strategy. The days following the discovery of the document were a strange duality. Outwardly, I maintained my routine, my composure, my professional facade. I attended meetings, completed my reports, interacted with colleagues as I always had. No change in demeanor, no hint of the seismic shift that had occurred internally. I even interacted with Charles and Eleanor, offering polite greetings, discussing work projects with the same quiet competence they were so accustomed to. They, still operating under the illusion of their secret plan, were cordial, perhaps even a little more so than usual. The way people sometimes are when they're concealing something significant. They saw a loyal, unsuspecting employee. They didn't see the woman who was now viewing every interaction through the lens of their impending betrayal, meticulously noting details, gathering subtle pieces of information that might become useful. My internal world, however, was a hive of quiet, focused activity. My analytical skills, honed over years of dissecting complex corporate data, were now turned inward, applied to my own situation. My home became my operational base. I started spending evenings and weekends not unwinding, but planning. The first step was understanding the legal landscape. My research wasn't just about severance pay, it was about the nuances of employment law, the definition of cause for termination, the rules around discrimination, even age discrimination. Though I was careful not to rely solely on that, preferring a more concrete path, and most importantly, the legal weight of evidence. I consulted quietly with a friend of a friend, an employment lawyer named David. He was initially cautious, listening patiently as I described the situation in general terms. When I began to outline the specifics, the timing relative to my pension vesting, another detail noted in the Chimera document, the questionable justification for redundancy given my current workload, the existence of the planning document itself, which I described hypothetically at first, his demeanor shifted. He recognized the potential leverage. He advised me on what constituted solid evidence. Emails, internal documents, official communications, timestamps. He stressed the importance of obtaining this evidence legally and ethically, without resorting to hacking or theft, which could undermine my position. This led to the next phase of my silent preparation, building my case, piece by piece, using only what was legitimately accessible to me in my role, or what was carelessly left exposed by others. I reviewed old emails, not just from Charles and Eleanor, but from other managers involved in the restructuring. I looked for inconsistencies, for directives that contradicted official policy, for anything that hinted at a predetermined outcome rather than a legitimate business decision. I paid close attention to the digital trail, documents saved on shared drives, meeting minutes, project files. It was tedious, painstaking work, sifting through mountains of corporate data, but I was driven by a quiet intensity. Each small piece of evidence I found felt like a tile being placed in a mosaic, slowly revealing the full picture of their actions and intentions. I realized that their arrogance wasn't just in the plan itself, but in their casual disregard for the digital footprints they left behind. They were so confident in their positions, so used to operating with impunity, that they were sloppy, and their sloppiness was my opportunity. There was also the human element. I paid closer attention to conversations, both formal and informal. Colleagues, particularly those in related departments, often shared frustrations or observations that, when pieced together, added context and corroborated details from the document. I didn't fish for information explicitly. I simply listened, processed, and filed away anything relevant. It was like collecting drops of water to fill a bucket. Each drop was small, but together they amounted to something significant. I also began preparing for the practicalities of their plan. I updated my resume, not with urgency or panic, but with a quiet, deliberate focus on my skills and accomplishments. I organized my personal files on my computer, ensuring nothing sensitive remained on the company network. I began to disconnect emotionally from the company, viewing it now as an opponent in a strategic game rather than a place of belonging.
This emotional detachment wasn't coldness. It was a form of self-preservation, a necessary step to ensure I could execute my plan without being hampered by sentimentality. The 15 years of loyalty were now a historical fact, a context for the betrayal, but no longer a tether. I still performed my job diligently.
In fact, I worked harder, faster, leaving no possible grounds for them to claim poor performance as a reason for termination. I wanted their official reason, redundancy, to be the only one they could possibly use, thereby highlighting its flimsiness given the workload I was handling. Every completed report, every successful project delivered, was a quiet refutation of their premise. It was a subtle act of defiance performed under their noses. They saw efficiency. I saw leverage. The underestimation continued. They saw a dedicated employee wrapping up her final projects. They didn't see the strategist meticulously dismantling their narrative, piece by painstaking piece, preparing to turn their planned ambush into a carefully orchestrated counterstrike. The day arrived, as anticipated. The email from Charles's assistant, requesting my presence in the conference room at 10 a.m., was a formality I had been expecting for weeks. It was the final act in their script. The moment they planned to deliver the blow, I arrived precisely on time, carrying nothing but my small notebook and a pen. I was dressed simply, professionally, in clothes that required no fuss or adjustment. My external appearance mirrored my internal state, calm, composed, ready. Charles and Eleanor were already seated at the conference table, the same one where I had found the document. The large windows behind them offered a view of the city skyline, indifferent to the human drama unfolding within the glass walls. Sarah from HR was not present this time, which I noted. This was a termination being handled directly by senior leadership, adding another layer to the formality and, in their minds, the finality of the event. Charles began, as I had described earlier, with the standard corporate preamble about difficult decisions and strategic shifts. His voice was smooth, almost soothing, designed to ease the delivery of unpleasant news. He spoke of market conditions, of the need for agility, of streamlining operations. All the while, he avoided direct eye contact, focusing instead on the papers in front of him. Eleanor offered her practiced vacant smile, a silent participant in the charade. I listened, my expression neutral, my posture relaxed. I offered no resistance, no interjections, no signs of distress. I simply absorbed their words, allowing the corporate speak to wash over me, identifying the key phrases they were using to justify their actions. They mentioned my role becoming redundant due to consolidation. They referenced a nebulous new structure that required different skill sets. These were the phrases outlined in the Project Chimera document. Hearing them spoken aloud confirmed the script they were following. It also confirmed that they were sticking to their original weak justification. They hadn't found a better reason in the weeks since I discovered their plan. This was a point in my favor. After Charles finished his prepared remarks, he slid the termination folder across the table, just as he had done in the hypothetical scenario I had envisioned. "This outlines the terms of your departure," he said, his tone softening slightly, as if this administrative act was meant to lessen the emotional impact. "We've included details on severance, benefits, continuation, and so on." He spoke of the severance package as if it were a generous offering, a salve for the wound they were inflicting. I picked up the folder. The paper was crisp, the ink sharp and impersonal. I didn't open it immediately. I held it for a moment, feeling its weight. This wasn't just a collection of documents. It was the physical manifestation of their attempt to discard me. It represented their power in their eyes, and in my hands it would become something entirely different. I met Charles's gaze directly for the first time since the conversation began. His expression was one of polite expectation, perhaps a hint of impatience. He was waiting for me to acknowledge the terms, perhaps express gratitude for the severance, or at least show some sign of being overwhelmed by the situation. "I understand," I said again, the same 2 words I had used in my earlier recollection, delivered with the same quiet control. My voice remained steady, devoid of emotion. This apparent lack of reaction seemed to confuse them. Eleanor's smile faltered slightly. Charles shifted in his chair. They were used to tears, to arguments, to emotional displays. My calm was disarming. It didn't fit their narrative of a shocked, vulnerable employee. Charles cleared his throat. "Do you have any questions?" he asked, perhaps hoping to prompt a more typical response, or simply to move the process along. I considered the question. I had many questions, of course, but none that I would ask them in this moment. My questions were strategic, not informational. "No," I replied simply. "Not at this time." The phrase, "not at this time," was deliberate. It implied a future time when questions might arise, questions they might not be prepared to answer. It was a subtle flicker of agency, in a moment designed to strip me of it. They seemed momentarily unsure how to proceed. The script didn't quite cover an employee who was calmly accepting their fate without protest or visible distress. Charles recovered, gesturing towards the folder. "The documents are all there. Please review them at your leisure. Sarah will be in touch regarding the final steps for returning company property, IT access, etc." I nodded again. "Understood." I closed the folder and placed it back on the table in front of me. I didn't pick up my notebook or pen. There was nothing more I needed to document here. This meeting was the confirmation, the timestamp I needed. The conversation had lasted less than 10 minutes. It was efficient, clean, and utterly lacking in genuine human empathy, precisely as I had expected from the authors of Project Chimera. Charles stood, a clear signal that the meeting was concluded. Eleanor rose with him. "We wish you the best in your future endeavors," Charles said, the final empty platitude. It sounded rehearsed, hollow. I stood as well. "Thank you," I said, my voice still even. There was no warmth in my tone, but no overt hostility either, just a simple acknowledgement of his words. As I walked towards the door, the folder remained on the table. I hadn't taken it with me. This wasn't an oversight. It was a deliberate choice. The folder containing their terms, their assumptions, and their limited view of my departure represented their control. By leaving it behind, I was signaling, in the quietest possible way, that I was not accepting their terms. I was not walking away on their conditions. I was walking into a future on my own terms. They watched me go, likely assuming I would retrieve the folder later, or that Sarah would send it to me. They saw an employee leaving after being terminated. They didn't see the quiet, measured steps of someone who was not leaving defeated, but advancing according to a plan they knew nothing about. The air in the hallway outside the conference room felt different, lighter. Somehow, despite the circumstances, the meeting was over. They had played their hand, exactly as I knew they would. Now, it was my turn, and unlike them, I wasn't playing with a script they could read. Leaving the office, after being formally terminated, felt surreal. It wasn't accompanied by a box of personal belongings or tearful goodbyes with colleagues. My departure was clinical, efficient, designed by the company to be as low profile as possible. After the brief, sterile meeting with Charles and Eleanor, I returned to my small, quiet office. I didn't pack anything. My personal effects were minimal: a framed photo, a favorite mug, a plant. These were not items of sentimental value in the context of my current focus. They could be retrieved later if necessary. My priority was data, not decor. I spent the next hour meticulously and legally securing the information I had been gathering for weeks. I forwarded key emails from my work account to my personal email. Emails that documented specific projects, communications with external partners that contradicted the idea of role redundancy, and internal directives that hinted at the true nature of the restructuring. I saved specific versions of reports and analyses that demonstrated the complexity and value of my work, files that were accessible to me as part of my job function. I did this methodically, carefully, ensuring I was not accessing anything outside of my legitimate scope or violating any company policy that couldn't be easily defended. I knew they would monitor my activity after the termination meeting, and I wanted every action to be unimpeachable. It felt like a final, quiet act of defiance performed within the digital walls of the corporation that had just cast me out. Each saved document was a piece of ammunition, gathered legally and ethically, ready to be deployed. As I worked, I felt a peculiar sense of calm satisfaction. This wasn't the rushed, panicked gathering of evidence born from sudden shock. This was the culmination of weeks of deliberate, strategic preparation. I wasn't reacting. I was executing. When I finished securing the necessary digital files, I shut down my computer. I didn't linger. There was no wistful glance around the office that had been my professional home for 15 years. That emotional connection had been severed weeks ago, the moment I saw my name on the Project Chimera list. The office was just a building now, a location where certain events had transpired, where certain people had revealed their character. As I walked out of the office for the final time, I carried only my handbag. No box, no visible sign of disruption. To anyone I passed in the hallway, I was just an employee leaving for the day. They had no idea that the quiet woman with the steady gaze was carrying the blueprints for dismantling a significant piece of the corporate structure she was leaving behind. I took the elevator down, rode the subway home. The city outside the window was bustling, full of lives moving forward, unaware of the contained drama that had just concluded within the corporate tower. I felt a sense of freedom, not just from the constraints of a job that had turned toxic, but from the burden of secrecy and anticipation that I had carried for weeks. The plan was now in motion. The moment of their intended checkmate had passed, and they didn't even realize they hadn't won the game. The first call I made upon arriving home was to David, the employment lawyer. "They did it," I said, my voice still calm. "This morning, just as I expected." "Redundancy? And the evidence?" he asked, his tone immediately shifting to professional focus. "Secured," I confirmed. "Everything we discussed, cleanly." "Good," he said. "Very good. Come to my office tomorrow morning. Bring everything you have. It's time to respond." The conversation was brief, precise. There was no need for lengthy explanations or emotional processing with David. He understood the language of evidence and strategy. He saw the case, the leverage, the potential for a favorable outcome. The emotional weight of the situation was my burden to carry, and I preferred to carry it privately. That evening, for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel the need to meticulously review documents or plan my next move. The planning phase was largely complete. Now came the execution. There was a quiet anticipation building within me. It wasn't vengeance in the sense of wanting to inflict pain for pain's sake. It was about justice, about accountability, about ensuring that their casual disregard for loyalty and their arrogant abuse of power had consequences. It was about reclaiming my narrative from the one they had attempted to impose. They had fired me, expecting me to disappear. They had unleashed a force they didn't understand. In the quiet satisfaction of knowing what was coming, of knowing that their confidence was built on a foundation of ignorance about my preparedness, was a potent antidote to the initial sting of betrayal. The folder remained on the conference table in Charles's office, a symbol of their failed attempt at control. My real leverage was intangible, residing in the digital files I had secured and the quiet determination in my resolve. They thought they had won the battle by firing me. They were about to discover that they had only just triggered the war, a war they were ill-equipped to fight because they didn't even know the weapon I possessed was the truth they had tried to bury. The meeting with David the next morning was a turning point. His office was quiet, lined with books on law, a stark contrast to the sleek, impersonal corporate environment I had just left. I spread the information I had gathered across his conference table, forwarded emails, saved documents, notes taken discreetly, of course, over the past weeks, detailing relevant conversations and observations. David reviewed everything methodically. He read through the email chains, examined the dates on the reports, cross-referenced details with the basic information he had about the company and my role. He paid particular attention to the documentation that hinted at the premeditated nature of my termination, the discussions that occurred well before any supposed restructuring justification could be genuinely applied. The Project Chimera detail which I recounted to him added significant weight, though the document itself wasn't in my possession. My detailed recollection of its contents and the matching language in their termination served as powerful corroboration. "This is strong," David said, looking up from the papers. His voice was calm, professional, but I could sense the shift in his assessment. "Very strong. The timing relative to your pension, the lack of clear performance issues, and this evidence suggesting the decision was made long before any genuine redundancy could be argued. This puts you in a powerful negotiating position." He explained the strategy. We wouldn't sue immediately. The first step was a carefully worded letter from his office to the company's legal department. It wouldn't be aggressive or accusatory. Not overtly. Instead, it would be formal, factual, and lay out the information we had gathered, highlighting the potential legal implications of their actions. The goal wasn't just severance. It was to negotiate a settlement that reflected the true nature of their actions and compensated me fairly, perhaps even significantly. It was about leverage, about forcing them to the table on my terms. David drafted the letter with precision. It referenced specific dates, specific documents, without revealing how they were accessed, simply that the information existed, and cited relevant sections of employment law. It was a quiet, professional declaration of war, delivered via certified mail. The silence that followed the sending of that letter was charged with anticipation. I continued my life, settling into a new routine, processing the emotional weight of the past few weeks. The initial hurt had faded, replaced by a quiet determination. I felt a sense of empowerment I hadn't anticipated. They had tried to take my livelihood and my dignity, but in their arrogance, they had inadvertently given me the opportunity to fight back, not with emotion, but with intellect and strategy. Their response came a week later, not directly from Charles or Eleanor, but from the company's legal counsel. It was cautious, formal. They acknowledged receipt of our letter and requested a meeting to discuss the matter further. This was exactly the response David had predicted. They weren't dismissing our claims out of hand. They were recognizing the potential risk. They still didn't know exactly what evidence we had, but they knew enough to be concerned. They still held on to a degree of their corporate arrogance, framing the meeting as a simple discussion, but the request itself was a concession. It meant they were taking our challenge seriously. The meeting was scheduled for the following week. David advised me on how to conduct myself: remain calm, stick to the facts, avoid emotional language, and let him handle the legal back and forth. My role was to be present, a quiet reminder of the individual whose life and career they had carelessly attempted to discard. As I prepared for that meeting, I felt a rising sense of satisfaction. This wasn't about gloating or revenge in a petty sense. It was about seeing the system, which they had manipulated for their own ends, being used to hold them accountable. It was about the quiet power of preparedness, of turning a moment of vulnerability into a position of strength. They had underestimated my intelligence, my resilience, and my ability to act strategically. They had seen me as a loyal, predictable employee who would simply accept her fate. They were about to learn the cost of that misjudgment. The simple act of their legal team requesting a meeting, of acknowledging the substance of our quiet, factual letter, felt like a small victory. The chessboard they thought they controlled had been rearranged, and they were being forced to play by rules they hadn't anticipated. The silence from Charles and Eleanor was telling. They were likely shielded from the initial legal maneuvers, perhaps still believing the matter was a simple termination. They didn't know the wheels were turning, driven by the quiet engine of my preparedness. The negotiation meeting took place in a neutral conference room downtown. David and I sat on one side of the table. The company's legal counsel, a sharp, experienced lawyer named Ms. Chen, sat opposite us. Charles and Eleanor were conspicuously absent. This wasn't a meeting about relationships or history. It was strictly a legal and financial discussion. Ms. Chen was professional, direct. She acknowledged my years of service, but reiterated the company's position that my role was redundant, as part of a necessary restructuring. It was the same script, delivered with legal polish. David responded calmly, presenting the points from our letter, referencing the timeline, the nature of my duties, and the specific evidence that contradicted the redundancy claim and suggested a premeditated termination unrelated to performance or a genuine structural need at that time. He didn't reveal the full extent of our evidence, choosing instead to allude to its existence and its compelling nature. He spoke of the legal concept of bad faith termination and the potential for a wrongful dismissal suit, highlighting the possible reputational damage to the company if the details were to become public. The conversation wasn't heated, but it was intense. It was a strategic dance, each side probing for weakness, assessing the other's resolve. Miss Chen pushed back, questioning the validity of our evidence, suggesting alternative interpretations, attempting to minimize the company's liability. But David was prepared for her arguments. He countered each point with facts, with legal precedent, and with the quiet threat of escalation. My role was exactly as David had advised. I remained calm and composed. I spoke only when directly addressed, answering questions factually and concisely. My presence was a quiet testament to the human reality behind the legal arguments, a silent reminder that their actions had directly impacted a person's life. I observed Miss Chen carefully. She was good, but I could see moments of uncertainty flicker across her face. When David referenced specific pieces of evidence she clearly hadn't anticipated us having. The fact that Charles and Eleanor weren't there spoke volume. They had handed the problem off to legal, preferring to avoid a direct confrontation. This was another form of underestimation, assuming that by removing themselves, they removed the personal element. They were wrong. Their absence only underscored the impersonal, calculated nature of their actions. David presented our proposed settlement figures. They were significantly higher than the initial severance package offered in the termination folder I had left behind. The figures weren't arbitrary. They were calculated based on lost wages, potential future earnings, the impact on my pension, and compensation for the manner of my dismissal. There was a long silence after David stated the numbers. Ms. Chen listened, her expression unreadable. She didn't immediately reject them, which was a positive sign. It meant they were taking the figures seriously. She countered with a lower offer, still higher than the original severance, but not meeting our demands. The negotiation continued, a back and forth of offers and counter-offers. David handled the financial discussions expertly, explaining the rationale behind our figures, reiterating the strength of our case, and calmly outlining the potential costs to the company if the matter went to court. The underestimation of me by Charles and Eleanor was consistently the quiet force in the room. They had calculated the cost of my termination based on a standard, unchallenged departure. They had failed to factor in the cost of dealing with someone who was prepared, who had evidence, and who was willing to stand her ground. That failure in their initial calculation was now costing them. Miss Chen took a break to consult with her clients, likely Charles and Eleanor. When she returned, her demeanor had shifted subtly. There was a new pragmatism in her approach. She knew we had leverage, and she was focused on finding a resolution to mitigate the company's risk. The negotiation became more focused, more direct. We were getting closer to an agreement. Sitting there listening to the legal and financial discussions about my value, about the cost of my termination, felt oddly empowering. It wasn't about the money itself. Not entirely. It was about the principle. It was about forcing them to acknowledge through financial compensation the wrong they had done and the value of the person they had tried to dismiss so easily. The battle wasn't over, but the tide had clearly turned. They had entered the room expecting to negotiate down from a standard severance package. They were instead negotiating up from a position of significant vulnerability, a vulnerability created by their own arrogance and my quiet preparedness. The silence in the room during moments of deliberation was potent, filled with the weight of consequence. They had acted in the shadows, confident in their anonymity and power. Now their actions were exposed to legal scrutiny, and the cost of that exposure was mounted. After several hours, the negotiation reached a conclusion. Miss Chen and David shook hands, a professional acknowledgement of a deal struck. We had reached a settlement figure that was substantial, significantly higher than the severance package originally offered. It wasn't an admission of guilt in the legal sense. The agreement included standard confidentiality clauses, but the financial terms were a clear reflection of the strength of our case and the company's desire to avoid public litigation. David reviewed the final settlement agreement with me, explaining each clause. It covered the financial compensation, the terms of my departure, framed now as a mutual agreement, a quiet shift from the initial termination, and the confidentiality obligations on both sides. It also included a neutral letter of reference, a small but significant detail ensuring my future employability wouldn't be hampered by their actions. Signing the agreement felt like a quiet, definitive act. It wasn't a moment of triumphant fanfare, but of calm resolution. The conflict was being resolved not through explosive confrontation, but through the systematic application of facts and legal leverage. The vengeance wasn't loud. It was embedded in the terms of the agreement, in the financial cost they were forced to bear, in the discomfort of being held accountable when they expected to act with impunity. Leaving the lawyer's office, the weight I had carried for weeks finally began to lift. The uncertainty was gone, replaced by a sense of closure and a quiet pride in how I had navigated the situation. I hadn't just reacted to being fired. I had anticipated it, prepared for it, and turned their weapon against them. The silence from Charles and Eleanor was deafening throughout this process. They were likely informed of the negotiations and the eventual settlement by Miss Chen, but they made no direct contact. Their detachment was consistent, reinforcing the impersonal nature of their initial actions. They were content to let their legal team handle the fallout, avoiding any personal responsibility or direct interaction with the person they had wronged. This absence, while perhaps intended to distance themselves, only underscored their cowardice and their inability to face the consequences of their own decisions. It was a different kind of satisfaction, knowing that they were likely uncomfortable, perhaps even angry, about the settlement, forced to pay a significant sum because of their arrogance and underestimation. They had tried to cut costs by eliminating my position. They were now paying a far greater cost because they had done so improperly and been caught by someone who was prepared. The confidentiality clause meant I couldn't publicly disclose the details of the settlement or the events leading up to it. But the true satisfaction wasn't in broadcasting their wrongdoing. It was in the quiet knowledge that I had held them accountable, that their actions had consequences they hadn't foreseen. It was in reclaiming my sense of agency and proving that I was not a disposable commodity. The experience changed me. It hardened me in some ways, eroding some of my naive trust in corporate loyalty. But it also revealed a strength within me that I hadn't fully recognized, the ability to remain calm under pressure, to think strategically in the face of betrayal, to transform hurt into focused action. It taught me the quiet power of preparedness, of gathering facts, and of using intellect as a shield and a weapon. The 15 years of service weren't erased, but they were redefined. They weren't just years of loyalty given. They were years of observation, of learning the internal workings of a system, of building the quiet expertise that ultimately allowed me to defend myself when that system turned against me. There was no dramatic confrontation, no public shaming. The resolution was quiet, contained within the legal framework. But the impact on me was profound. I had faced betrayal and emerged not just financially compensated, but emotionally stronger, with a deeper understanding of my own capabilities. The quiet vengeance wasn't a moment. It was a process, culminating in a resolution that affirmed my worth and exposed the cost of their underestimation. The folder I had left on the conference table was likely discarded, forgotten. It represented their initial limited view of the situation. My view was broader, encompassing not just the immediate termination, but the strategy for the aftermath. And in that aftermath, operating quietly and deliberately, I had achieved a victory they hadn't thought possible. They had tried to write me out of their story. Instead, I had written my own ending, one where I wasn't the victim, but the one who held the final, unread chapter. Life after the settlement began. It wasn't a sudden dramatic change, but a gradual recalibration. The substantial settlement provided a cushion, giving me time to breathe, to decide my next steps without the immediate pressure of needing a job. More importantly, it provided validation. It was a tangible acknowledgement of the value they had tried to discard and the wrong they had committed. I took time for myself, not to dwell on the past, but to process the experience and refocus on the future. I reflected on the 15 years at the company, not with bitterness, but with a critical eye, extracting the lessons learned. The most significant lesson was the importance of self-reliance and the danger of placing unconditional trust in corporate structures. My network of colleagues, particularly those who were also quietly undervalued or had faced similar experiences, became more important. We shared insights, offered support, and recognized the systemic issues within the corporate world we had inhabited. There was a quiet solidarity among those who had seen behind the curtain. The neutral letter of reference, while a formality required by the settlement, was actually useful. It allowed me to pursue new opportunities without the shadow of a contentious departure. As I began exploring new professional paths, I found that my skills in analysis, strategy, and navigating complex systems were highly valued, perhaps even more so now that they were coupled with the resilience and quiet confidence forged by the recent events. I wasn't seeking a similar corporate environment. The experience had shifted my perspective. I was drawn to roles where integrity and genuine contribution were valued over internal politics and ruthless efficiency. I considered consulting, leveraging my deep understanding of corporate operations without being ensnared by them. I explored opportunities in nonprofit sectors, where the mission felt more aligned with my personal values. The possibilities felt broader, less constrained by the narrow path I had been on. There was a quiet satisfaction in building something new for myself, something entirely independent of the company that had tried to dismiss me. The power struggle was over, but the empowerment it had ignited within me was ongoing. I remained discreet about the details of my departure and the settlement, honoring the confidentiality agreement. The true impact wasn't in public revelation, but in the private knowledge that I had stood my ground and achieved a measure of justice. It was in the subtle shift in my own demeanor, a newfound assertiveness, a clearer sense of my own worth, a quiet confidence that came from knowing I could handle significant adversity with intellect and composure. I occasionally heard snippets of news about the company through former colleagues. There were rumors of internal shifts, of unexpected departures in senior leadership. I didn't seek out this information, but when it came to me, I noted it with a quiet, detached interest. I didn't feel the need to track their struggles as proof of my victory. My victory was personal, internal, and already achieved through the settlement, and my own recovery. The narrative of my departure, from their perspective, was likely framed internally as a simple redundancy, a necessary business decision. They maintained their facade, but I knew the truth. And more importantly, they knew that I knew the truth, and that knowledge had cost them. The underestimation that had been their consistent blind spot had ultimately proven expensive. My quiet vengeance wasn't about destruction. It was about correction. It was about ensuring that their actions had consequences, that their power wasn't absolute, and that an underestimated individual armed with facts and determination could challenge their narrative and reclaim her own. The final resolution wasn't a dramatic climax, but a return to calm, albeit a different kind of calm. It was the peace that comes from having faced a significant challenge and emerged stronger. It was the quiet satisfaction of knowing that the script they had written for me was not the one I ultimately followed. And that in itself felt like a profound and lasting victory. The feeling wasn't triumphant exultation, but a deep-seated sense of earned pride, a quiet understanding that I had honored my own worth when others had tried to diminish it. As I moved forward, the lessons of that time became integrated into my approach to both professional and personal life. The experience of being underestimated, of discovering a hidden agenda, and of strategically responding didn't just impact my career trajectory. It shaped my perspective on power dynamics, trust, and resilience. I developed a keener sense of observation, a greater ability to read situations and people, and a healthy skepticism towards pronouncements of authority. The quiet intensity I had tapped into during the planning phase wasn't something I turned off. It became a part of me, a reserve of strength I knew I could access when needed. It wasn't about being constantly guarded or cynical, but about being grounded in reality, understanding that intentions aren't always transparent and that preparedness is a powerful form of protection. My interactions with others shifted subtly. I valued sincerity and integrity more highly. I gravitated towards people who demonstrated genuine respect and fairness. The superficial relationships built on corporate hierarchy held no interest for me. I sought out environments where contributions were recognized on merit, not on position or political maneuvering. I became an advocate, in small ways, for those who were also underestimated or facing unfair treatment. Having experienced the vulnerability of being targeted by those in power, I felt a quiet responsibility to support others navigating similar challenges. It wasn't about fighting every battle, but about offering guidance, sharing insights, and encouraging others to find their own voice and build their own form of preparedness. The concept of evidence as a weapon extended beyond legal documents. It was about valuing truth, about documenting reality, about refusing to let others define your experience or erase your contributions. It was about understanding that facts, delivered calmly and strategically, could dismantle even the most carefully constructed narratives of power. The underestimation I had faced became, in a strange way, a source of empowerment. It had forced me to look inward, to rely on my own capabilities, and to discover a strength I hadn't known I possessed. Their dismissal wasn't the end of my story. It was the catalyst for a new, more authentic chapter. The silence from Charles and Eleanor was permanent. I never expected an apology or an acknowledgement of the human cost of their actions. Their world was one of transactions and outcomes, not empathy or introspection, and I no longer needed their validation. My validation came from within, from knowing how I had handled myself, from the quiet satisfaction of the resolution, and from the strength I had gained. The quiet vengeance had served its purpose. It had restored balance, affirmed worth, and cleared a path for a future built on my own terms. It wasn't a story of loud triumph, but of quiet resilience, strategic thinking, and the profound power of refusing to be defined by someone else's limited perception of you. The scar remained, a reminder of the betrayal, but it was no longer a source of pain. It was a symbol of survival, a testament to the fact that even in the face of calculated cruelty, it was possible to find strength, regain control, and build a future that was not just prosperous, but also deeply aligned with one's own values. The narrative had come full circle, from the quiet calm before the storm, through the strategic preparation and the measured response, to the earned pride of a cathartic resolution. The story wasn't just about being fired, it was about being underestimated, and about the quiet, powerful consequences that followed when that underestimation proved to be entirely, utterly wrong. And in that quiet power, there was a profound and lasting satisfaction. The passage of time continued its indifferent march, bringing new seasons, new challenges, and new opportunities. My life settled into a rhythm that felt both peaceful and purposeful. The legal settlement funds were managed wisely, providing a sense of security that allowed me to make choices based on passion and principle rather than solely on financial necessity. I eventually found a new professional path that was deeply rewarding. It wasn't in the same industry, nor was it in a traditional corporate structure. It involved leveraging my analytical skills and strategic thinking in a way that felt genuinely impactful. Working with people whose values resonated with my own, there was a refreshing lack of the internal politics and power plays that had characterized my previous environment. It felt like breathing cleaner air. The experience of the termination and its aftermath became a part of my history, a significant chapter but not the defining one. It was a crucible that had tested me and revealed my capacity for resilience and strategic action. I no longer felt the need to revisit the events with frequency, either in my thoughts or in conversation. The resolution had been achieved, the lessons learned, and the emotional processing complete. The quiet vengeance had done its work, leaving behind not bitterness, but a quiet understanding of human nature and corporate realities. I maintained connections with a few trusted former colleagues, those who had shown genuine character during my time at the company. We shared updates about our lives and careers, a small network of individuals who had navigated similar transitions. There was a mutual respect forged in the shared understanding of the complexities of the corporate world. I never directly learned how Charles and Eleanor fared in the long run. My focus had shifted entirely away from their world. Their fate was ultimately irrelevant to the life I was building. The consequences of their actions, for me, were the settlement, the lessons learned, and the new path I had forged. The consequences for them were contained within their own system, dealt with by their legal team, and perhaps by internal repercussions I was not privy to. The quietness of the resolution, the lack of public spectacle, felt right. It wasn't about external validation. It was about internal integrity and strategic execution. The power lay not in public humiliation, but in the knowledge that I had responded to their attempt to diminish me by quietly and effectively asserting my worth and ensuring accountability. The language of my life became less corporate, less guarded. While the ability to be precise and analytical remained, my communication became more open, more aligned with my authentic self. The emotional restraint that was necessary during the conflict gave way to a more balanced expression of feelings in safe contexts. The journey from suppressed hurt to earned pride was complete. The pride wasn't boastful. It was a quiet, deep-seated satisfaction in having navigated a difficult situation with dignity and strength. The quiet corporate thriller had reached its conclusion, not with an explosion but with a return to calm, a calm born not of ignorance but of knowledge, preparedness, and successful execution. The symbolism of the discarded folder remained a potent reminder of their initial underestimation, a physical manifestation of their belief that they could simply discard me and the matter would be closed. But the real story unfolded off the table, in the quiet spaces of preparation and strategic response. And in that quiet space, the true power shift occurred. My story was a testament to the fact that being underestimated is not a sentence, but often an opportunity. An opportunity to reveal strength, to exercise intellect, and to quietly, effectively, rewrite the ending that others assumed was yours. The final feeling wasn't one of lasting anger, but of profound peace and quiet confidence in the path ahead. The vengeance was quiet, yes, but its impact for me was lasting and deeply empowering. The years continued to unfold, each one adding layers to the life I was building. The experience of being fired, and the subsequent legal battle faded from being a central focus to a significant formative event in my past. It was a reminder of a challenge overcome, a lesson learned, and a source of quiet strength. I invested the settlement wisely, providing a foundation for financial independence that offered further freedom in my choices. It wasn't just money, it was a tangible result of my efforts, a physical manifestation of the value I had defended. It represented not just compensation but vindication. My career progressed along the new path I had chosen, one that felt more aligned with my skills and values. I found satisfaction in contributing to projects that had a positive impact and working with colleagues who shared a sense of purpose. The skills I had honed in strategy and negotiation proved invaluable in this new environment, used now not for defense against betrayal but for constructive outcomes. I sometimes thought about the concept of revenge drama as it applied to my story, but the term felt too simple, too focused on inflicting pain. My actions weren't driven by a desire for Charles and Eleanor to suffer, but by a need for accountability and a refusal to be a passive victim. The quiet satisfaction came from the restoration of balance, the affirmation of my worth, and the demonstration that their power was not absolute. The story was more about empowerment than pure vengeance, about reclaiming agency and rewriting a narrative that had been unfairly imposed. I saw evidence in the world around me of similar power imbalances, of individuals being marginalized or underestimated. The experience had made me more empathetic to these situations and more aware of the quiet ways in which individuals can push back against systems that are designed to disempower them. The evidence as a weapon metaphor resonated beyond legal contexts. It was about the importance of truth, of documentation, of having the facts on your side. It was a reminder that integrity and meticulousness can be powerful tools. My emotional landscape, once marked by suppressed hurt and controlled anger, had transformed. There was a deep-seated calm, a quiet confidence that wasn't easily shaken. The vulnerability I had felt in the initial moment of discovering their plan had been replaced by a grounded understanding of my own resilience. The silence from the company remained unbroken. There was no attempt at contact, no acknowledgement of the past. It was as if they had sealed off that chapter, preferring to move forward as if nothing significant had happened. And for me, that was acceptable. Their validation was unnecessary. My focus was entirely on the future I was actively creating. The underestimation they had of me remained their lasting error. They saw an employee, they didn't see the strategist, the investigator, the resilient individual who would not only survive their attempt to discard her but would turn the situation into a source of strength and opportunity. The quiet vengeance had been effective, not because it was destructive, but because it was precise, strategic, and fundamentally based on truth. It had forced accountability where none was expected, and had paved the way for a future built on my own terms. And in the quiet of that self-built future, there was a profound sense of peace and earned contentment. The final reflections on that period of my life centered not on the injustice itself, but on the transformation it ignited within me. The betrayal, painful as it was, served as a catalyst. It forced me to confront vulnerabilities I hadn't acknowledged and to tap into strengths I hadn't fully utilized. The journey from being an underestimated employee to someone who had successfully challenged a powerful system was more than just a professional shift. It was a fundamental reshaping of my identity. The composure I had maintained throughout the ordeal, the emotional restraint that was so necessary, wasn't about suppressing my feelings entirely, but about channeling them into focused, strategic action. The anger was there, yes, but it was cold, controlled, and directed towards achieving a specific outcome, rather than lashing out indiscriminately. The quiet satisfaction that followed wasn't fleeting. It was a deep, resonant feeling that reaffirmed my belief in my own capabilities and the power of acting with integrity and intelligence. The legal settlement was a significant component of the resolution, providing financial security and validation. But the true catharsis came not from the money, but from the knowledge that I had successfully navigated a treacherous situation and emerged with my dignity intact and my future brighter. The symbolism of the discarded folder, the evidence I had gathered, the quiet communication with my lawyer. These weren't just actions, they were markers on a path towards reclaiming control. They represented the tools I had used to dismantle a narrative of powerlessness and build one of resilience. The silence from Charles and Eleanor was a final quiet confirmation of their character. They chose avoidance over accountability, detachment over difficult conversation. And in their silence, my own voice, the voice of my actions and my resolution, became louder, at least to myself. The vengeance was quiet, dignified, and ultimately empowering. It wasn't about inflicting pain, but about enforcing consequences. It wasn't about winning a battle of wills, but about winning a battle of facts and strategy. And in that quiet victory, there was a lasting sense of peace and strength. The story wasn't just about being let go after 15 years of loyalty. It was about the quiet, unforeseen consequences that followed when loyalty was betrayed and an underestimated individual decided to write her own ending. The path forward was clear, built on the foundation of lessons learned and strength discovered. The quiet corporate thriller had concluded, leaving behind not wreckage, but the quiet hum of a life reclaimed and powerfully lived. The seasons turned, years passed. The events surrounding my departure from the company receded further into the past, becoming a chapter in a much larger book. The experience had fundamentally altered my perspective, sharpening my awareness of power dynamics and reinforcing the importance of self-reliance and strategic thinking. My life was no longer defined by that chapter, but it was undoubtedly shaped by it. The quiet satisfaction remained, a steady undercurrent beneath the flow of daily life. It wasn't something I dwelled on constantly, but it was a quiet knowledge that informed my decisions and interactions. It was the calm assurance that comes from having faced a significant challenge and emerged stronger and wiser. The legal settlement provided security, allowing me to pursue work that was not just financially stable but also personally fulfilling. I found satisfaction in contributing to projects that aligned with my values and working alongside people who shared a sense of purpose and integrity. The professional path I forged felt authentic, a true reflection of my skills and priorities. The silence from the company was complete. No contact, no attempt to revisit the past. And that was precisely as it should be. My life was entirely separate from theirs, built on a foundation they had attempted to undermine, but had ultimately, inadvertently, strengthened. The underestimation had been their error, a costly one that had allowed me to operate beneath their radar, gathering the tools necessary to ensure accountability. The quiet vengeance wasn't about retribution for its own sake. It was about restoring balance, affirming worth, and demonstrating that actions have consequences, even when those actions are taken from positions of power. It was a testament to the power of preparedness, of quiet resolve, and of trusting in the strength of truth and fact. The narrative of being let go after 15 years of loyalty was transformed into a narrative of resilience, strategic empowerment, and quiet victory. It was a story not of a victim discarded, but of an individual who, faced with betrayal, found the strength and intelligence to reclaim her future on her own terms. And in that quiet reclamation, there was a profound and lasting peace. The years since my departure have brought a deeper understanding of the impact of that period on my life. It wasn't just about recovering from a professional setback. It was about a fundamental shift in how I viewed the world and my place in it. The initial hurt and controlled anger had long since dissipated, leaving behind a quiet strength and a clear perspective. The corporate world, with its complex hierarchies and often ruthless pursuit of profit, was a system I now understood with a detached clarity. I had seen its inner workings, its capacity for both great innovation and casual cruelty. That understanding informed my choices, allowing me to navigate professional landscapes with greater awareness and less naivety. The quiet vengeance had not been a destructive force, but a force for self-preservation and restoration. It had ensured that I was not simply a casualty of corporate restructuring, but an active participant in determining the outcome of my situation. The financial settlement was a tangible measure of success, but the true victory was the intangible sense of empowerment and the knowledge that I had handled myself with dignity and strategic intelligence. The people who had underestimated me, Charles, Eleanor, and others involved in Project Chimera, remained a distant, almost abstract presence in my past. Their actions had set events in motion, but the outcome was ultimately determined by my response. Their underestimation had been their blind spot, the critical error that had allowed my quiet preparedness to flourish unseen. The silence from them was a form of closure, an indication that they had moved on, perhaps assuming the matter was resolved with the legal agreement. And for me, it was resolved, but not in the way they had initially envisioned. My resolution was about more than just financial terms. It was about reclaiming my narrative and affirming my worth. The story wasn't just about losing a job after 15 years. It was about finding strength in vulnerability, about the power of quiet preparation, and about the enduring impact of strategic resilience. The quiet corporate thriller had ended, not with a bang, but with a settled calm, a peace forged in the crucible of betrayal, and tempered by the steady application of intellect and resolve. My life continued, built on a foundation of experience, strength, and a quiet confidence that came from knowing I could face significant challenges and emerge not just intact, but fundamentally empowered. The vengeance was quiet, yes, but its resonance was profound and lasting, a testament to the quiet power of an underestimated individual who refused to be erased. Looking back now, with years of perspective, the events surrounding my termination feel less like a personal tragedy and more like a pivotal point, a sharp turn in the road that ultimately led me to a better place. The hurt that initially accompanied the betrayal has softened into a kind of gratitude for the lessons learned, for the strength discovered, and for the opportunity to rebuild my life on a foundation of greater authenticity and purpose. The quiet vengeance was not about bitterness or resentment clinging to the past. It was about a decisive action taken in a specific moment to correct an injustice and assert my value. Once that action was complete and the resolution achieved, the need for vengeance dissipated, leaving behind only the quiet satisfaction of knowing I had handled the situation with integrity and strategic competence. The underestimation by my former bosses was the spark, but my response was the fire, not a destructive inferno, but a controlled burn that cleared the way for new growth. The silence from them is a permanent feature of the past, a quiet backdrop to the vibrant life I have built in their absence. Their world and mine are entirely separate now, connected only by that brief, intense period of conflict and resolution. And in that separation, there is a profound sense of freedom. The story of being let go after 15 years isn't just a story about job loss. It's a story about the hidden strengths that emerge when faced with adversity, about the quiet power of preparedness, and about the dignity found in responding to betrayal, not with chaos, but with controlled, strategic action. The quiet corporate thriller reached its conclusion, not with dramatic fanfare, but with a quiet settling, a peace that came from within, from knowing that I had honored my own worth and ensured accountability. The journey was challenging, but the destination, a life lived with purpose, integrity, and quiet confidence, made the difficult path entirely worthwhile. The vengeance was quiet, the victory was quiet, and the resulting peace was the most profound quietude of all.